So, today on the podcast, we finish up our three-part story about Walt Disney and the advent of color in film. Full-color movies weren't introduced through major studios such as Warner Brothers or MGM, nor were they first introduced through popular live-action features. Full color finally came to the big screen through Disney animation, and for years, Disney animation would be the only type of film where the public would see full color up there on screen. For 3 years, color cartoons would open for black and white features from major studios. And this is where we pick up our story today. After developing 4 distinct color processes over nearly 2 decades, inventor Herbert Kalmus finally brought his new Technicolor offerings to Disney with the hope that Walt might help bring color movies to the world. And so, if you're ready for the final part of this story and to explore how animation changed the way the world saw films, let's go. Early in 1932, Herbert Kalmus invited Walt Disney to his office to review the new 3-strip process, which allowed for a full range of colors to appear on screen. The new Technicolor camera was arranged so that a prism divided light passing through the lens into 3 paths, through 3 different colored filters to create 3 colored records on 3 strips of black and white film at the same time. In 1932, 3 records were the only way to create, through a lengthy process, a full-color image for a moving screen. The 3 color records were used to create 3 matrices that then, with a dye process, could be used to build up a full-color positive print that could be shown on the screen. But there was an added benefit to this process, particularly for animation. The 3 records allowed the processing department to manipulate the colors after the film had been finished. In the processing lab, technicians could increase or decrease the level, depth, and value of each primary color, allowing a production company to have greater control over how the color values appeared on screen, much like painters did with a canvas. Walt was intrigued by this process and was interested to talk with Herbert Kalmus. In ways, the 2 men were a study in opposites. Kalmus, nearing the age of 52, described by one paper as tall and grim-jawed, still carried the reserved nature of a Boston businessman, while Walt, having just turned 31, exuded a youthful Midwestern affability. After seeing samples, Walt saw the potential of the Technicolor process. When I saw the 3 colors and I saw it all on one side of the film, I was very excited about it, Walt said. It was expensive. I wanted to go right away to color. At the time, Walt had a nearly finished Silly Symphonies cartoon called Flowers and Trees, a musical story of 2 trees in love. Walt wanted to wipe the paint from the finished cells once the black and white camera work was finished, and then redo those cells with color. This was possible because Walt's ink and paint artist inked the outline of each character on one side of a cell, while the painters added color to the opposite side. That is, the current colors, the grays, whites, and blacks, could be wiped off from one side of the cell without damaging the inked outlines on the other side. The painters then could simply repaint the cells with color. Walt was hopeful that this new process, full color on a movie screen, would again elevate the quality of Disney animation technically above that of rival studios, just as Disney had done 4 years earlier with the presentation of sound and music. With a 3-strip process, the cartoon Flowers and Trees would hopefully be a showcase for the range of color now available in film. The greens of the foliage, the blue of the sky, orange and yellow bursts of a forest fire, and at its close, a rainbow arcing across the sky. But Walt's brother Roy, the studio business manager, was against it. The reason he was always, Walt explained, I've said before, he always lived with figures and figures. From a financial standpoint, Roy's reasons were sound. The studio's new distribution contract with United Artists provided $15,000 in negative costs for each cartoon. These figures were based on a budget to make black and white material, not color. The contract didn't allow for additional expenditures without approval. Roy explained that with this plan, Technicolor would get rich, Disney would go bankrupt. But Walt still wanted color, as he saw it as another way to distinguish his work from that of other studios, particularly older studios in New York. Also, color could be a way to make cartoons something more than an add-on at the local theater. As Walt recalled, I argued, he argued. Their disagreement didn't simply stay in their offices, it spilled out into the studio. Roy had a fit and said this was absolutely impossible. One animator subsequently hired would later explain. Roy believed that the increased processing and print cost would mean that the films would lose money. He estimated that the additional costs, including the paint and other production costs, might elevate each film by $10,000. That is an increase of over 60%. Walt believed that color would lift the whole series. He assumed that the increased quality would lead to extra bookings and longer playdates, thereby bringing an additional income that would offset the additional expenses. I just had a feeling that color was the thing. Walt would later explain, that's all. Actually, I couldn't put up any sensible argument, but after seeing the options, I just felt stupid to go ahead and make them in black and white. But Walt did have one sensible argument that appealed to the financial values of their film. In the long run, color would be re-releasable, Walt told Roy. Anything in black and white would not. Then he asked Roy a question that would end the argument. Would you, meaning Roy, want to go back to the old silent films? Roy knew that silent films, only a few years old now, were impossible to rent out. As a concession, Walt agreed that he would use color, at least for now, only on the Silly Symphonies cartoons, the lesser known of the two Disney series. Perhaps he would only use color on this one symphony as a test. The Mickey Mouse shorts sold just fine on their own in black and white. On February 15th, Roy contacted United Artists, tentatively advancing Walt's proposal with some obvious reservations. Roy understood that the financial problem was twofold: the increased production cost, which the Disney studio would have to absorb, and the increased cost for color prints, which United Artists would likely have to absorb. Both of these costs would be figured against a cartoon before it delivered a profit. We would like to have your reaction to the idea of producing this one in color, wrote Roy, not with any thought of making any other symphonies in color, but just to try out the idea on this particular subject, perhaps only for large first-run theaters. He explained that the studio would also produce a black and white negative of flowers and trees, which could be used to make lower-cost black and white prints for a wide release. From his vantage point, Al Lichtman at United Artists saw three-strip color animation as an experiment, a very expensive one, considering the cost of prints produced by Technicolor. But Walt, Roy, United Artists, and Technicolor eventually reached an arrangement whereby this cartoon would be produced in color. For Flowers and Trees, the Disney studio would produce a black and white version as well as one in color. To limit costs, United Artists insisted that Disney create no more than 20 copies of the Technicolor print, with the rest being the traditional black and white. The plan as it was arranged at this time would allow for the cartoon to exist as a showpiece in elaborate first-run houses, while most regional theaters would receive a black and white copy. Kalmus recalled that one other element entered the negotiations at this time. Walt came back to me with a proposition. If Disney pioneered with the new process, would we give them exclusive rights to the process in cartoons for 2 years? Walt himself recalled that Technicolor had a perfect right to do it because it was still experimental with them. I said my brother is against it. It's going to cost a lot of money. We don't know how we'll get it back. Walt and Kalmus both remembered this discussion happening around February 1932. Though a firm exclusivity clause wouldn't find its way into the contract for another year. Regardless, that exclusivity arrangement solved 2 problems. First, it gave Walt and Roy a way to make money off color by allowing them exclusive access to the technology in animation beyond their current fixed-price 12-month contract with United Artists. And second, it offered Kalmus a showpiece vehicle to premiere his 3-strip process around the world with the possibility of other cartoons to follow. With a deal in place, the gray-toned paint was washed off from the cells used to make flowers and trees, with the ink lines left on the other side. Then those same cells were repainted with color, largely by women artists in the ink and paint department. The color paints were commercially prepared and not specifically designed for this first film work. They offered a limited range of colors, though the values could be offered slightly by mixing the paints. The largest problem, however, was their durability. These paints didn't adhere to the cells as easily as the gray, black, and white paints had. They often chipped, leaving lines or worse, tiny black spaces. To fix this problem, the women in the paint department began to mix in glue with the paints to better adhere the color to the cells. Likewise, the background images for this cartoon were repainted or in some cases painted over with color. At the Technicolor office, technicians adapted one of their 3-strip cameras into a lens-down table mount unit similar to equipment used by most animation studios to shoot cell animation. But unlike current table cameras at the Disney studio, the Technicolor camera, likely due to its size and weight, would only be able to pan north and south. East and west movements would need to be secured by moving pegs. By late February, Technicolor was filming tests of the color Disney material at its office. Unlike live-action directors, Walt Disney and his team of artists were overtly attuned to nuances in color. The Technicolor lab found it needed to adjust saturation levels and color temperatures so the finished print better matched the final cell work completed by Disney. When Walt was satisfied with these tests, he invited Sid Grauman, owner of Grauman's Chinese Theater, to the studio to view them. Roy remembered that the test accounted for roughly a quarter of the finished film, but Walt said it was far less. It must have been just a minute of film, Walt said, and that's all Sid wanted. Grauman, based off of that minute or two of footage, agreed to premiere the whole cartoon with the Eugene O'Neill feature, Strange Interlude, which was opening in a few weeks. With this booking, Disney rushed through the refilming of Flowers and Trees to ensure that a color print was available to Grauman by the delivery date. Robert Cook, who worked as a Disney cameraman, recalls generally how Disney engaged color cinematography during these years. We didn't have a color camera on the lot, so I used to go over at midnight and start at Technicolor and shoot the color pictures over there, likely with a Technicolor cameraman working on the project as well. From there, Mink Nelson, a Disney background painter, worked with the doctor's ex-wife, Natalie Kalmus, to ensure that the colors were balanced in the final print. By the time the color negative was finished, cost for this one-reel cartoon totaled roughly $19,000, 4,000 of which the studio would need to absorb beyond the United Artists allotment. The additional cost wasn't as high as Roy feared, but still, it represented a significant increase. The film still might make money, but any additional funds the studio received would come near the end of its release after all other costs, including print costs, were recouped. Everyone at the studio knew that the shift to color represented a significant risk, a high-stakes gamble which might not only cost Disney thousands, but might damage the studio's relationship with its distributor, United Artists. When Walt went into color with Flowers and Trees, his wife Lillian recalled, Roy was scared, and so was I. In Los Angeles, Flowers and Trees premiered at Grauman's Chinese Theater on July 18, 1932, a show that would either present the short-lived novelty of three-strip color or herald a shift in how motion pictures were made. When the curtain pulled back, the Hollywood audience saw, for the first time, a full range of colors on screen, with the image retaining the sharpness of a black and white print. A grove of trees lifting their branches woke from their nighttime sleep, raising their amber arms against a periwinkle sky. Flowers lifted their yellow petals, and caterpillars, tiger-striped orange and black, sauntered across the ground. A hush came over the audience as on screen they saw how the materials of filmmaking were possibly changing before their eyes, the old two-toned cinematic traditions giving rise to new dreams. Kalmus was told that the cartoon got a more enthusiastic response than the feature. As far as Disney could tell, the premiere was a success. After the screening, Roy wrote a letter to Al Lichtman, his contact at United Artists. It received a very wonderful hand at the finish, he said, and comments on its beauty could be heard all around the audience as it was being run off. The letter was likely designed to help lay the groundwork for subsequent color efforts at Disney. In exchange, Lichtman questioned whether Disney should be experimenting with color, especially as the nation's economy remained in near ruins. But Roy responded that he and Walt were often focused on aspects of quality that exceeded profit. Well, I realize that Walt and I do not run our business on a strictly business basis, Roy confided. But honestly, we have more concern over re-entrenching ourselves during these difficult times by making our product as desirable to the exhibitor as we possibly can. Film Daily exclaimed that Flowers and Trees put the cartoon on a new plane of importance. The color work is exceptionally well handled. It looks as though color has definitely scored in the animated field. When the cartoon premiered at the Roxy Theater in New York, Abe Waxman, advertising director for the Roxy, was so taken with the Disney effort that he promoted the 6-minute short with advertising fanfare usually reserved for a feature. He included it in all his newspaper ads, put a large display board on the side of the theater, mentioned it prominently in the program, and put Silly Symphony up in blazing light on the marquee. As a result, the Silly Symphony received more critic notices than any short ever featured in a New York theater. A month after its opening, Film Daily reported that, as a result of the tremendous reception at Grauman's Chinese in Los Angeles and at the Roxy in New York, Walt Disney says all the symphonies to be released this year by United Artists will be done in Technicolor, and that later the Mickey Mouses may also be photographed in natural color. Flowers and Trees was in the nature of a feeler. It was made to touch out the public's reaction. After after seeing the audience response and likely sensing that such notices would fuel free publicity, United Artists decided to place a full order of color prints of flowers and trees, discarding their plan to issue the cartoon as a black and white short in wide release. At the time, 200 one-reel prints would cost $12,000. Walt would later claim that the LA premiere in particular brought an avalanche of orders and bookings. Though the additional U.S. bookings, which were arranged on a flat rental fee basis, wouldn't bring in significant funds, United Artists was able to rent the color film to overseas outlets at roughly twice the price of a standard black and white Disney cartoon short. With increased interest in the Silly Symphonies, that fall United Artists approved 3 more Disney cartoons in color to go into production, despite the elevated costs of Technicolor. That year, the Motion Picture Academy expanded out its award categories to include one for Best Animated Short, with Walt walking away with a win for Flowers and Trees. The Oscar, Walt's first, added to Roy's argument that United Artists should support even more color cartoons. Days after the Academy ceremony, on December 2nd, United Artists agreed to an amendment that would allow all 6 additional Silly Symphony cartoons under contract to be in color. In July 1933, after color proved effective in increasing Disney's audience, United Artists allowed Disney to move to an all-color contract. This contract would formally solidify a conversation between Walt and the Doctor the previous year that Technicolor would only apply its 3-strip natural color process in animation to films being produced by Disney, leaving other animation studios to use their 2-strip process or an inferior process developed by other companies. For the next 2 years, audiences wishing to see full natural color would be drawn to Disney cartoons, as it would take 2 more years before a major studio released a full-length live-action feature using the 3-strip Technicolor process. Full-color cartoons did prove financially successful for Disney, though perhaps not as successful as Walt had imagined. By March of 1934, almost 2 years after its release, according to one Disney artist, Flowers and Trees had netted $30,000. The studio had also found commercial options to expand its color possibilities in terms of new paints. But the pairing of animation and Technicolor was not always ideal. By 1935, the studio still saw variance in color. The Technicolor process does not always reproduce colors faithfully, Walt explained. Therefore, the background artists must anticipate the Technicolor vagaries and compensate for them in advance. For example, if they want a strong red in a certain scene, they must use a weaker red in painting the background because Technicolor exaggerates red. The first Disney artist to color coordinate the studio efforts with Technicolor, Mink Nelson, lasted 2 or 3 years, and then, as Disney artist Claude Coates recalls, Walt was kind of dissatisfied with him. By the middle of the 1930s, Disney's Technicolor films still had the color values of comics, not the nuance of real life. To manage these concerns, Disney hired a watercolor instructor and color theory expert from the Chouinard Art School named Phil Dyke to work with Technicolor. As the studio's color coordinator, Phil Dyke ensured that on-screen color matched the intended value. Mine was purely an arrangement between Disney and Technicolor, Dyke would later explain, to find out how better reproduction and quality could be gotten in film. His assignment was to review test prints, or dailies, and to respond in terms of color fidelity to the expected value, not necessarily to painted value. To say to Technicolor, this looks too light or too dark or too red or too yellow or too pink, until the on-screen presentation matched perfectly the Disney vision. Dyke soon learned that Technicolor could control the color density in each scene and on each of the three color matrices, as well as saturation ratios between the three colors. But their process didn't have much control over contrast, such as the graduation between the white and black through grays. The Technicolor process tended to deepen contrast. That problem would need to be handled by the Disney artists, with the background painters and the cell painters lightening dark colors such as black, brown, deep blue, and so on, and graying down the whites. The Technicolor process would deepen contrast back to the color values Disney really wanted to have on screen. Likewise, the Technicolor process didn't perfectly reproduce colors, particularly in the red-orange range. For this, Dyke found paints such as slightly lighter reds that would then produce the desired values, such as slightly darker reds, on the screen. But color accuracy wasn't Walt's only end goal. In 1936, after reviewing recently finished films, Walt told his staff, "We're not going after the comic supplement coloring. We have to strive for a certain depth and realism." As the studio worked to expand color, the paint lab began to mill its own paints, to increase its color options, and to ensure visual accuracy in finished cells. Walt was proud of telling visitors to the studio that their lab could produce hundreds and hundreds of unique pigments. At one point in the late 1930s, someone at the studio, possibly Phil Dyke, arranged massive color charts, some nearly covering a full wall from floor to ceiling, that showed how different paints would register via Technicolor on the screen. The result of Phil Dyke's work with Technicolor can be seen in the short cartoon The Old Mill, that not only tested the multiplane camera, but experimented with a richer and more nuanced color palette. In terms of color, this cartoon was a decisive step away from the high-contrast comic book colors of early Disney efforts to a more painterly approach used by subsequent features with a focus on complex visual color harmonies. But sophisticated color choices meant that studio animation was increasing both in quality and cost. I remember Roy coming into the office about this time with a bunch of figures in one hand and eyes full of patient resignation. Walt would later explain. "Well, how come," Roy began, "how come the last year with 30 men we made 30 pictures, and this year with over 150 you get out only 18? Walt, in recounting the story, was clearly exaggerating. The Disney output was never as high as 30 shorts per year, but after the advent of color, production did shrink from about 20 to 24 shorts each year to around 18. As always, Roy's anxiety subsided when Walt pointed out that even though cost per picture was rising, so were the profits. In ways, Disney and Technicolor were ideally suited for each other. Technicolor needed a low-risk way to premiere its new full-color process, and the Disney films provided exposure and proof of concept. For its part, Disney, a relatively small studio in Hollywood, was looking for ways to grow and to effectively compete with better established New York animation studios. In this, Technicolor offered the Disney studio a way to distinguish its cartoons from those of its rivals. The exclusive use of sharp, full-range color helped Disney expand its market reach, widen its audience, and present a company image that spoke to both art and commerce. Around the Disney lot, the acquisition of 3-strip color also provided one more benefit. It was an important step toward the full-length animated feature that, even then, Walt was beginning to plan. lifelike characters that would inhabit a fairy world, a film that would finally make animation a centerpiece attraction on any theater program. In ways, this brings us to the end of the story of how the Disney studio in the 1930s helped introduce full color into Hollywood films. But to wrap up today, I have a number of interesting little postscripts to add. 1. Though specifically milled paints were important to expand color, it wasn't just about the paint. In the years that followed Flowers and Trees and other films, as Technicolor refined its process, in part for Disney, color became a way to key mood into animation. Visual tone wasn't simply a choice between black and white and color, nor was it merely selecting a strong paint or color palette to define a cartoon. Rather, Disney worked with Technicolor to arrange chemical and film printing processes that would allow the depth of color to be realized on screen when desired. That is, the developing Technicolor process, along with the Disney Paint Lab, became a way of creating unique color values or color combinations on screen, in large part to affect the emotions that viewers saw when watching a film. 2. The lingering problem of color. The first live-action feature shot fully with 3-strip Technicolor didn't appear until 1935, a feature called Becky Sharp, 3 years after Flowers and Trees. Up until its release, industry observers wondered if an audience would experience eye strain when exposed to 2 hours of deep color illuminated on a large screen. One Technicolor strategy to combat possible eye strain was to advise directors to use darker tones and to avoid deep saturation. This advice appears to have been followed closely as Snow White moved through development. Even after Becky Sharp premiered, many industry observers wondered if the richer tones associated with animation might prove problematic for an audience exposed to a color feature of 90 minutes. The advice about darker, less saturated color guided Disney through Snow White and also its second feature, Pinocchio. Its third feature, Fantasia, signaled a shift in its use of color. But this too has an interesting story. The first section of Fantasia that the studio engaged, called The Sorcerer's Apprentice, started in 1938. This employed darker color values, deeper tones, just like in Snow White. The Sorcerer's Apprentice was originally envisioned as a standalone two-reel cartoon starring Mickey Mouse. But as the collaboration between Disney and symphony conductor Leopold Stokowski developed, the standalone cartoon became the centerpiece for a much larger 2-hour feature that would contain a series of musical compositions. Fantasia is literally a document that shows the evolution of Technicolor in Disney animation through the late 1930s. Though The Sorcerer's Apprentice, the first segment started for Fantasia, retains the darker colors of Snow White and Pinocchio, sections later developed, such as the Pastoral Symphony and Dance of the Hours, have brighter, bolder, and more saturated colors. Such brighter color schemes would dominate much of the studio's feature output in the decades that followed, once Disney was convinced that eye strain wasn't a problem for an audience watching 2 hours of animation. 3. Disney's relationship with Technicolor also brought key employees into the Disney studio. In 1932, when Disney first started with Technicolor, one of the camera maintenance men at the Hollywood lab was Roger Broggie. Broggie would stay with Technicolor for another year before transferring to Universal to work in special effects. 6 years later, when Disney was moving from the Hyperion lot to new facilities over in Burbank, it wanted to expand its own camera department. To do this, it hired 2 men once associated with the Hollywood Technicolor lab, Dick Jones, who was one of the original Technicolor transplants from Boston, and Roger Broggie, both men being engineers and railroad enthusiasts, would be essential to Walt years later as he experimented with railroads at the studio, at his home at Carrollwood Drive, and later at Disneyland. It's possible that without the acquisition of Roger Broggie, and to a lesser extent Dick Jones, Walt may have never explored model railroading in such a way that brought him into a place from which he could envision an amusement park of his own, a park that to a large extent grew out of his interest in trains. And lastly, number 4, a little about that unusual divorce between Herbert and Natalie Kalmus. After 1939 and the release of The Wizard of Oz, which was a Technicolor spectacular, Herbert Kalmus would live out his days as the principal purveyor of color processes in Hollywood. Though other companies, particularly Eastman Kodak, would develop color, it never held the richness or depth of Technicolor. To friends, Herbert Kalmus was always the doctor. To strangers, he was Mr. Technicolor. For the rest of his life, Herbert Kalmus kept a low profile in Hollywood. In fact, many Hollywood insiders better connected the name Technicolor with his ex-wife Natalie than they did with the doctor. After the couple's divorce, filed in 1921 and finalized in 1922, Natalie spent the next 3 decades inserting herself into the Technicolor company and its later fortunes. The doctor's second wife would later claim that Herbert was unprepared for Natalie's gambit. Shortly after the doctor hired his ex-wife Natalie into the Technicolor company, presumably so she could live out her final year in the warm California environment, he learned that she had no life-threatening heart condition at all. But Natalie, once in California, remained as the company's lead color advisor, with studios contractually required to hire her onto each Technicolor live-action production, sometimes at a pay rate of $1,000 a week. During these years, Natalie saw her role as selecting, colors as a means of causing emotion and mental reactions in keeping with the spirit of the film's plot. In other instances, she insisted that she was using color to amplify the personality of screen talent, particularly that of leading ladies. Each person has a color vibration, she explained to one reporter. Color affects both the nerve and emotion centers of an individual. If you have a color on you that vibrates to your personality, it gives you verve, life, interest. More than once, including on Gone with the Wind, she battled with directors over the color of costumes, makeup, and sets, insisting that her selections be used in a film to best represent the ability of Technicolor. In most every film created with the Technicolor process, she received a screen credit as a color director or color advisor, while the doctor remained invisible. When the doctor was out of town, she took to using his house with his permission, as his home was far bigger than her own. She introduced herself as Mrs. Kalmus so often that very few people in Hollywood knew that she and the doctor were actually divorced. When people saw the doctor out on a date, they assumed that he was actually cheating on Natalie. Despite these unusual arrangements, relations between the doctor and Natalie existed civilly for years, with Natalie on a multi-year contract that guaranteed her an extremely high salary at Technicolor through 1948. But as the contract wound down, the problems really began. In 1944, she threatened to bring suit against the doctor, claiming that their 1922 divorce had been a sham and that they had continued for decades to live in a manner of husband and wife, sharing a residence, though not a bed. She had also taken a set of love letters that Herbert had kept at his house, something that might embarrass him, which she used in a manner consistent with blackmail. Beyond this, Natalie believed that, as their divorce had never been fully enacted in practice, she was entitled to a much larger share in the growing Technicolor fortune. Out of court, the doctor agreed to pay her what was described as an impressive sum if Natalie would acknowledge their divorce in writing and also return those stolen love letters. In 1948, as her contract ended, she sued for half of Technicolor's present value, again claiming that their divorce had been a farce, despite the fact that the divorce had been legally approved in 1922 and that a few years earlier, in writing, she had acknowledged the validity of that divorce as well. Early in court proceedings, the judge decided that Natalie's petition did not entitle her to have her court costs paid, leaving her in a position whereby she lacked legal representation. Despite this, she called nearly 60 witnesses and produced a rambling 2,000-page document designed to show that her divorce had been a charade. In the end, the court would have none of it. At the end of his life, the doctor was remembered for two things: overseeing the development of Technicolor, which amounted to his life's work, and also being party to one of the most unusual divorce proceedings in Hollywood, a scandalous trial that was featured for years in society columns and later offered as a text case in various law schools. Toward the end of these legal proceedings, however, the doctor remarried, finding in this new relationship the comfort of a reliable family, a sense of well-being that he had yearned for since he'd been a boy, after losing first his mother and then later his father. In animation circles, he's remembered as the person who brought full color to animation through the Disney studio. I'll be back next week with a new episode. As next week is the first Sunday of the month, we'll have our news and analysis episode then. There's a number of stories that I've been following over the past week that have taken interesting turns. Also, next month, we'll start in on a new story about the history of the Disney company, a story that I've been developing literally for years. Lastly, as you know, we're an ad-free, listener-supported podcast. We do just two things: deep dives on stories related to the history of the Disney studio and the parks, and news and analysis of current events as they relate to the Disney company. We are funded entirely by listener contributions, specifically by listeners who join us on Bandcamp as monthly subscribers. On Bandcamp, you'll find over 200 episodes not available on iTunes or anywhere else. But the best reason to join us there is to support the work we do here and to make sure that this podcast continues to exist. You can support us by becoming a monthly subscriber at dhipodcast.bandcamp.com. I'll also leave a link down in the show notes. So, until next Sunday, this is Todd James Pierce.